Alrighty, hello everybody. So we are going to be talking about a little trick inside of Unreal Engine on how you can go ahead and use the texture parameter inside of your materials to really punch up and make your VFX a whole lot more useful, whether that be for your own personal projects or if you're working in the game industry or as a hobbyist or whatever you're doing. If you're in UE4, this is a trick that will make your life a whole lot easier and give you a whole lot more bang for your buck. So I'm gonna show you some cool things you can do with it and hopefully kind of open your brain to kind of a thought process on how to think about using the node that you maybe hadn't thought about before, and just a general thought process to think about when going into creating your VFX that can help you down the road. Alrighty, so a quick overview of what we're going to be going over in this video. So I'm going to start off by actually going into the material editor and showing you the texture parameter node, and then from there we will hop on over into actually talking about how you can take that and utilize it in a couple different ways, not only within the material itself, but also then transitioning it into using it within blueprints and within VFX. And lastly, we will go into some examples and demonstrations on how I've used this to hopefully give you some inspiration. That's what we're going to be doing today. I will put timestamps on the screen here if you want to skip to a particular section or skip back around if you get confused and need to go back as well. Alrighty, so what we're looking at here is a blank material inside of UE4. If you've never played around with materials inside of UE4, this is what it looks like if you go ahead and open one up and there's nothing going on inside. Get rid of this guy here. Alright, so this is what they look like, totally empty with nothing going on inside. So what we're going to do is go ahead and right-click an empty space, search for texture. Now, if you go ahead and click on just a standard texture sample, that's fine. If you have a pre-existing material, these are likely what you already have inside. These are fine. These work just great. Let's go ahead and give it something because it will get very angry with us if it doesn't have an input in it. It'll scream and give us error codes. And we'll just feed it into the base color for now. So what this will do, if you're not familiar with materials, is it's going to input that into whatever the slot is. In this case, it's the base color, so it's just going to apply that as the color for the whole material. But when we were to save this material, and then we will go ahead and get us an instance of this. So here's our material on an object. We have no access to changing what texture is going onto this. So once our material is out in the world, it is out in the world and there's nothing we can do to change it except going back in to the material itself. So once it's out there in the world, you can't really change it except going back into the editor, which is fine, but it's not the most efficient system. Unless we turn this puppy into a parameter here. Now there's two ways to do that. If you've already got a texture sample in your material and it already exists, you can actually just go ahead and right-click it, convert to parameter. Most important thing, please do make sure to go ahead and name that something that's going to go ahead and make sense to you. In this case, it's our base color, so we're going to go ahead and name it base color. Always important to make sure you name your variables and parameters something that's going to make sense and tell you what it is going down the road. So whatever you're using it for, name it that. Otherwise, you are going to have a rat's nest of variables and parameters, and you'll never know what any of them are for, and you'll spend 20 minutes every single time you open up something, clicking and playing around with them, trying to figure out what they do, especially if you haven't used something in a couple months, or even worse, a couple of years. I've gone back to a VFX 6 or so months after I've made it, and just stared into the abyss, trying to figure out what on earth I did and what I named things. So just always have a logical naming convention when you're naming your parameters here. So, now that we've got this as a parameter, save this again. Any day UE4, there we go. And go back to our instance. Aha! Now, we have the ability to, at any time, change that texture to anything we want. Whenever. There's no one stopping us. We don't actually have to go back in and change that master material, and this can be separate for every single instance of that main material. So, what what we're looking at here is a material that I've made that has a whole bunch of things going on. At the center here is a material function. We're not going to get into the actual VFX or this material here. This is not a tutorial for this particular effect. That would be its whole own crazy shenanigans. But I'll go ahead and show you what it does, so I'll be better able to explain the parts of it that I am going to be discussing. So here is an instance of it. Let's show it on a cube because it's a little easier to see. Go. So the part we're going to be talking about particularly is the texture parameter values. So there's a scalar on this material that controls a burn rate. So we're going to go ahead and turn that on just so you can see it activated. Let's turn it down a little bit more. There we go. So in this particular case, how it's burning out is controlled by the texture parameter that I've named burn mask. If we change that to any other texture in here, let's find one that'll look interesting. This one might be fun. It completely changes the look entirely. Like, this is not even the same object. Let's find some other interesting ones. Wood. It's a really cool sci-fi. I actually think I used this for the sci-fi one. I think. Yep. I used wood oak for that one. Let's see. Rust. Yep. That one's quite interesting. See some other fun ones. Ooh, that's fun. That's very sci-fi. Interesting. So, as you can see, that is one single parameter. But because that single parameter isn't just a scalar with numbers or a color or anything like that, it's a texture. That parameter has essentially infinite possibilities because it has infinite amount of things you can put into it. As long as you have an image available in your content browser, it can be thrown into this. Now, not all of these will particularly look good in anything you feed into it. It depends on what it's going into. Ooh, that one's interesting. You can even throw normal maps on this and it will react in different ways. That one's actually really cool. I haven't tried that one before. Interesting. But regardless, because texture parameters, unlike a scalar, can have any texture be put into it, and you can put as many textures into Unreal as you have in your project, and you can draw anything for a texture parameter, you have a pretty much infinite capacity for customization, where this starts to become this magical infinite tool that allows you to do some really crazy spectacular things rather than just putting textures on things. Because of course, texture parameter value, the default that we use this for is to put a normal on, to put a base texture on, but that's what we would generally use this for. However, if you're sneaky, we can use it for something else. Let me go ahead and show you. Let's take a look at another place I've used this, because obviously in this case, I've just used it as what is essentially an opacity mask. Parameterizing that is fancy, not super fancy, but certainly worth doing. Anything that you can make accessible after the fact so that it doesn't have to constantly be sent back to the artist is useful. Where this can get real snazzy is when you can essentially turn your VFX into a tool just by accessing parameters inside of your materials. So, what we are currently looking at on screen here are all the same blueprint, the exact same blueprint, just pulled into the scene 10 times, but they look completely different. Because I've made accessible a series of parameters so that when you switch those out, you can get an infinite amount of different magical circles from one single blueprint. The actual building behind it for the VFX is exactly the same, but because we've made this texture parameter for each of the objects available, as many circle textures as you want to draw is as many circles as you can possibly think to create. So let's take a look at how I've built this into the blueprint, rather than just utilizing it within a material and then obviously adjusting it within the material instance, which is the simplest way to do it. You can actually build it into a blueprint and then have it be a part of that. The way this works within a blueprint is using the create dynamic material instance function. So essentially what this does is on runtime, it creates a material instance that exists only within the context of that runtime for the blueprint. It doesn't actually create a new material instance within your content browser. It just kind of exists in the ether for runtime, for that blueprint in its own little context. So what it does here is it creates the material instance, and it takes a variable that the user can set of what that texture parameter is going to be. The user gives that value. It sets that to the dynamic material instance. There are a couple of other things like the brightness and the color that can be set. All of those things can be run through the dynamic material instance, and because of that, when you hit runtime, or in reality it is pretty much when you drag in, you will get the ability to change these entirely dependent on that individual blueprint. So these are all the same blueprint, but they're independent of each other. They're their own little instances of themselves, but they're not creating a new instance every time I go through here. So you're not seeing magic circle inst, magic circle inst 2, magic circle inst 3. You're not cluttering up your content browser with a giant pile of insts like you would be for materials, which is the lovely fun of Mr. Dynamic Material Instance. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to just showing you a couple of examples of where I've used these concepts, so hopefully it'll give you a little bit of inspiration on just some of the things you can do with it. Here are a series of cubes. These have 4 material instances of the same master material. These are the ones we were showing earlier. So these are all from the same master using the same material function, but because of how I've adjusted the parameters in them, you get totally different looks. Up next we have those magic circles again. Again, these are all one single blueprint, and then just using texture parameters to create a ton of different varying looks for these. And here you have 10 different options of them, all splayed out together, and then I've got a couple of close-ups here so you can see them up close, what they look like. This is a force field generator tool that I created. These took me probably 5 or 6 minutes to put all of these together just using standard UE4 texture assets that come with the program, but I was able to get all of these different varieties and looks together just because I'd parameterized the texture slot in the material. So it really kind of goes to show you just how much power you can get by making these things accessible to either yourself or to whoever the user of your VFX or tool is going to be. So that's all I've got to show you for these. Hopefully, this little tip and demonstration has given you some ideas and some inspiration on ways that you can use this in your own work and in your own tools in VFX, and kind of give you a mindset and an avenue in ways that you can expand your own work. That's everything I've got to show you. I hope it helped. Thank you for watching and stopping by the channel. Feel free to check out any of the other awesome videos, and thanks for stopping by Game Cottage. Have a nice day, guys.